Yeah, Trey, Jennifer. Well, this index, it's a culmination of roughly 4 years of work by FEMA and other officials, roughly 80 actual experts putting this all together in a big data set. It's a new tool for emergency managers to eventually even document events like this river flooding that we're seeing throughout Horry County right now, but most importantly, to monitor the risk and, of course, plan ahead. The Grand Strand has its share of severe weather and natural disasters.
This is a way of pulling all this information together in one place.
It's called the National Risk Index. It's a brand new tool just released by FEMA. The index looks at 18 natural hazards or disasters that could impact communities, everything from hurricanes to heat waves. For coastal Carolina, that includes flooding, hurricanes, high wind, among other severe weather. In fact, the template for this index originated in SC, according to Susan Cutter at the University of South Carolina.
The Social Vulnerability Index, the Baseline Resilience Index for Communities, and the SHIELDIS database, which were all developed at the University of South Carolina, have now seen national exposure.
It's a welcome tool for emergency managers like Brandon Ellis in Georgetown County.
We're vulnerable to, I guess it would be 16 of the 18. This information will be, very important, very valuable as we continue to move forward and grow that plan in the future.
The index not only looks at risk, but vulnerability and the resilience of communities. For instance, Horry County is listed under a relatively high vulnerability.
One of the first steps in dealing, mitigating, and lessening risk is identifying that risk and knowing where in our community is the highest risk.
Roselle there with FEMA tells me that this index, albeit being one of the first of a national scale for emergency managers, also includes a brand new criterion for them to look at. It's called the Composite Risk Index. It's also a calculation fixed in there, bunch of complicated numbers. I'll let you read more about it on WPDE.com. But most importantly, he tells me it's also a living map. Like the FEMA flood maps that we see redone annually or quarterly, they plan to keep adding to this data set as time moves forward. And he tells me they plan to do that pretty soon, 2021, most likely, with new data that they gather from the U.S. Census. For now, live in Horry County, Andrew James, ABC 15 News.
It's flooded 8 times since 2013.
Peace along Pitch Landing has not been easy for Connie Johnson.
I mean, we live in fear.
She's called Pitch Landing home since Hurricane Floyd. 2020 marked the 5th year in a row of them seeing impacts from storms.
We were stranded for 9 days one time and then 11 days another time.
They were displaced for all of 2019 and stranded in 2020.
I think we're being forgotten.
That's a fear State Representative William Bailey says he wants to fix.
We know in the next 3 or 4 years, if not sooner, we're going to see the same thing happen again, and it's not fair to people who live in these areas.
He first took office as families like Johnson returned to their waterlogged homes. Since then, he says the priorities he ran on changed.
In my opinion, it's more important than the interstates and the road situation that we have, because when it comes up and it impacts someone's life, it destroys their life.
He helped spearhead an interstate effort to ask for more studies of the river. This summer, he got close.
Recently, we reached out to Clemson University and we took an old idea, an old plan, and we gave it to an independent source, Clemson University, to look at. And they gave us some thoughts and some comments on the old diversion idea.
The Little River Diversion Canal, or Greenway, as he would like to see it. It was the county's mission in 2009, but it was scrapped after the Army Corps of Engineers said costs would not meet benefits with unknown environmental impacts.
But I can see the potential benefit of trying to divert that water from Conway because there's a large population there.
Daniel Hitchcock leads the studying and data collection along the Waccamaw and PD rivers at Clemson. He answered Representative Bailey's call to review the canal plan.
First recommendation is to have a hydraulics study to really understand the impacts of that water being diverted from Conway.
Hitchcock and his team have keyed in on the mouth of the river into the Winyah Bay. There, he's found a problem with how we understand the river.
There's really not enough data in a lot of these waters downstream that could really be helpful.
He says Horry and Georgetown counties should look at asking the Geological Survey to come in, but when it comes to fixing the flooding,
it's more of a larger scale engineering project to understand you know, what the potential impacts of that canal would be, both positive and negative.
How much can county folks do at the end of the day before state and federal dollars, the big dollars, need to come in and address this?
They can't do a whole lot, but the thing is I don't think we've ever made a true effort to try to look at the Waccamaw River in the same instance as we do, say, building an interstate, where we combine the effort between different state governments and county governments.
Bailey says in the end, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will need to be brought back in.
At the end of the day, having the Corps there means all the difference between it being an idea and actually coming to fruition.
When was the last time the Army Corps of Engineers did a larger scale feasibility study on the river?
We have not done a study like this on the Waccamaw. We've done smaller scale.
Officials there tell me they have not done a feasibility study, which could lead to federal dollars on mitigation projects in decades. The last I could find was roughly 40 years ago.
I mean, the Charleston District personnel would love to have a study like that, but ultimately Congress makes that decision through legislation. So one of the things that our non-federal sponsors can do that we cannot is they plead the case so that they can get the eye of Congress and get into that legislation.
It's a plea that can come from people like Bailey and Johnson, who is a symbol of the costs brought by flooding.
The water has nowhere to go. I don't know what the solution is, but I do know that it is a bad situation.
In late fall, the Army Corps of Engineers actually paid a visit to Horry County, meeting with county leaders in person. Their discussion, the river and riverine flooding along it. Now the county has begun the process of gathering data in hopes of sending a plea to Washington to intervene along the Waccamaw. For now, in Horry County, Andrew James, ABC 15 News. With the rain comes the rise. It's deja vu along Lee's Landing.
Last February, yeah, it was flooded all the way down up around. I don't remember how high it really was.
Neighbors like Mike Hanlon are rushing to protect what's on the ground floor. For him, it's a 1970s El Camino.
It seems like every winter now we flood.
Hanlon still has access to River Road, unlike several of his neighbors. He plans to hold their mail for them, but with more rain on its way, he may soon be stuck as well.
That corner right there, and probably down Lee's Landing Road to about right there, that'll all be flooded.
Wetland drainage like this is on its way. This is along Highway 905, and Michael Lee says the overflow from a nearby swamp keeps getting worse. Would it be safe to say this is probably a classic flash flooding site?
Yes, and I would say since Hurricane Matthew, every time we have a heavy rain now, it has become more and more of a occurrence.
Rushing flood water like that has already pushed some neighbors out of their own driveways on Waccamaw River Drive, River Road, and Cypress Knee Court. Along Roe Pond Road, neighbors have to kayak and wade in flood waters. It's another winter along the river to start another year of uncertainty for river communities.
We've gone through a few of them. There's one guy down the street, he's ready to leave again. So he was just putting his house up for sale, and you can't even get to his house right now.
Right, the time has come. We've talked about it. It's time to start doing something.
And this time, county leaders have a new tool to understand flood risks.
You could continue to construct, but your structures would have to be elevated by other means other than fill. So
the potential end to filling in wetlands in Horry County. It's a controversial building practice. Now, new maps provided by Western Carolina University show more land could be at flood risk.
I think it's time for us to really take a hard look at these areas and to do away with slab construction and the fill inside of those areas.
It's a fight that Highway 90 neighbors like Amelia Wood have carried on since the storm.
It was needed a long time ago because right here in Tilly Swamp, we've got homes that are being built where they wouldn't be if we had those regulations in place.
Now the county will begin the process to draft requirements on construction within the Florence flood zone, calling for more tree preservation and limiting or prohibiting dirt fill of lowlands. That's something the county says happened more in 2020 than in the past 5 years.
Well, I don't think the developers are going to like it. I think that it might cause them some extra expense and maybe not as many profits, but in the long run it'll help the consumer.
A buildup of frustrations.
If I seem irritated, it's because I'm irritated.
Now channeled from neighbor to lawmaker to power company officials, specifically Cube Hydroelectric and Duke Energy. The two operate several dams along a North Carolina river that feeds into the PD region.
There is no lack of compassion here. There isn't. There is compassion. There is a lack of storage capability. We don't have it.
Their testimony came before a joint committee with local state reps and senators, some not pulling any punches when it comes to where they place some of the blame for recent flooding.
You don't think you're responsible for it a little bit?
Energy officials fighting back, saying the dams were not made to control flooding and that their priority is to keep them from being damaged.
So there's really no mandatory reason to look downstream when we're about to spill water. It's because we have to. We have no other choice.
Lawmakers say since 2015, Horry County has flooded more often. Something also happened around that time that they say seems suspicious. The two companies had their operating federal licenses renewed.
What happened in the FERC license and the conditions thereof between those 2 years? Something did.
The FERC is the Federal Energy Regulation Commission. According to SCD&R officials, they and SCDHEC have input on these licenses and if the companies can obtain them.
Our leverage is their FERC license. Period. I mean, that is our leverage for folks that are operating outside of South Carolina.
In Columbia, Andrew James, ABC 15 News. Neighbors along the Waccamaw River are exhausted seeing reports like mine from mid-February. As the river gauge still sits at just 12.5 feet in that range right now for the Noah River gauge down in Conway, it's expecting to still rise another foot in the coming days. Before it was all over, the water rose another 3 feet. Rick Mariner lives along Lee's Landing Circle.
I could tell by the way the river was running, the amount of rain, that it was going to be a lot higher than what the gauges indicated.
He's called the river home for more than 20 years. He relies on the National Weather Service river level forecasts.
I looked at them every day to see how close I was going to be.
But in Mariner's eyes, the river gauges that check the water height and flow forecasts have been lacking in recent years.
They're always behind the 8 ball with those gauges.
The most recent flood event lasted from mid-February to early March. The river crested at 15.6 feet, the 7th highest recorded event at Conway.
February, in Conway and other rivers, the one in Conway was the biggest non-tropical flood in the history of the gauging site there.
Rick Newertz leads the Wilmington National Weather Service for river forecasting as the service hydrologist. He stands by their forecasting from February.
If you have another event, the rivers are still responding to that rain that wasn't initially in that 48-hour rainfall forecast, then the forecast is naturally going to go up. And so I think that can lend to the perception that forecasts were wrong. They weren't with the information that was in them at the time.
At least twice, the Weather Service updated their forecast, altering the situation significantly for homeowners. First, on February 15th, they forecasted moderate flood stage by February 18th. On February 18th, the morning report, the forecast was still within that flood stage. By that evening, though, it changed. The river was now forecast to go to major flood stage, rising more than 1.5 feet. The same happened on February 23rd, where the gauge reading was above what they were forecasting. Hours later, they raised the forecasted height to above 15 feet.
It's really a very complicated river system. It's one of the most complicated river systems that our office deals with in the Southeast.
Jeff Dober is with the National Weather Service at the Southeast River Forecast Center. He says the river is impacted by rainfall entering river valleys in North Carolina and the tidal effects at its base in Georgetown. He says the forecast in February was impacted by more than just rain.
We thought the local heavy rainfall was going to sort of blend in with that backwater effect. And then over time, we realized that the backwater was a little bit more of an influence.
He says the PD River flooding caused that. The difficulty in monitoring has groups like the South Carolina Conservation Coalition concerned. This April, they sent a letter to state lawmakers asking for more investments on the river for forecasting. They wrote, a seemingly small but vital first step would be the installation of flood and rain gauges along the rivers alongside consistent monitoring with data being publicly available and routinely updated. It's a question I took to the Weather Service.
Would this be all made a lot easier if there were more gauges on the river?
More gauges are always better. Now, one thing that's really important is that river forecasts are based on river flow. It's the amount of water moving through the river. If there's going to be more gauges, they need to give us flow because the flow is the stuff that is actually forecast.
Adding more or making improvements to the current ones is something Mariner wants to see.
If they could make the gauges more accurate somehow for the next couple of floods, That would really help us.
I also reached out to the U.S. Geological Survey. They're behind the hardware for these river gauges, and they tell me that they perform maintenance on them every 6 to 8 weeks. Now, in order to see more of them along the river, they say that funding will need to come partially by local entities like the Horry County Stormwater Department, local governments, as well as the council governments. Well, I reached out to the county for this story, and they tell me at this time, river gauges are not in their proposed budget. For now, in Horry County, Andrew James, ABC 15 News. Keeping neighbors out of harm's way.
Knowing where it floods and knowing where that historical risk has been and where those historical catastrophic damages have been are half the battle. And so I think this tool really does achieve that.
That tool being the Map Your Move web application launched by Horry County staff.
That really helps to minimize people buying a product that floods.
April O'Leary is a flood victim advocate, and she welcomes the tool after months of asking for an easier way to show the flood risk for home buyers in places like Saukesty.
Almost every single family that has flooded historically in the past in Horry County that we work with, and we work with hundreds of them, had no idea the type of flood risk that they were basically vulnerable to.
Homeowners and home seekers can see flood maps, past flood impacts like road closures, and proposed flood maps showing the greater risk of impacts across the county.
So a consumer can ride through a community and quickly see what the hazards are for the area.
Michelle Duncan knows what homes are at risk. She's a broker in charge at Duncan Properties and often sells along the river.
We don't have to think, we know that that's something that we have to consider.
As a realtor, she supports having the risk information and neighborhood information in one spot. Now neighbors can use the site to know where emergency services or amenities are nearby.
I know the county may intend it for people who are outside of our area moving in, but I think it's for everybody.
In Horry County, Andrew James, ABC 15 News. A waterway wedged in the middle of flooding worries.
We live in the crease between the ocean and the upland.
Now, researchers are hopping on board to better read the water.
This is a tremendous broad coalition.
With sonar, sampling, and gauging, the Coastal Carolina University team led by Paul Gaze launches the Smart River Research Program along the ICW near the Waccamaw River.
There are things now that get us that information about flooding and things like that, but it's not at the accuracy that we want. By bringing things down here into the intercoastal and where we need that information, it'll be less of a hit or miss or a guessing game as to whether you will be affected.
New, hard data in an area where flooding impacts many, but little is known on how tides and rainfall contribute to it.
We really don't have the data that's needed in order to get there. But Duke has made the commitment to help provide that data.
The devices were funded through several National Science Foundation grants and a 6-figure contribution from the Duke Energy Foundation. That will further the research in areas underserved by federal gauges.
We're no longer modeling, we're measuring. When you have people being flooded out of their house 15 times in 3 years, we have a dire issue.
Measurements that make all the difference when the waters rise again. In Horry County, Andrew James, ABC 15 News. Hurricane Florence left a mark that Tammy Baker will never forget.
It's very hard emotionally to live through that.
Horry County used some lessons learned from Hurricane Florence to develop new flood maps with that storm's high water mark as the standard. The maps are the foundation of newly proposed regulations for building in the special flood hazard area or in the 100-year flood zone.
It helps protect people from exacerbated flood levels.
County Council will vote to require homes be built 3 feet above the base flood level, increasing that by 2 feet from current standards.
I think it'll make a world of difference because if the water can just pass on through and not get in your living room and your bedroom, you know, you're going to be able to recover so much faster.
I know for Saukesty that 3 foot is good because that puts us slightly above Florence.
Another key change will be how the county handles offsetting the loss of wetlands to development. County records show nearly 25 acres of wetlands have been filled in, with most of that happening in the past 3 years. The ordinance would require a developer to dig up land on their site to hold floodwater if they fill in wetlands.
I don't know if it's far enough, but it's definitely a good starting point.
It marks a starting point that leaders say will prepare new homeowners and prevent devastation from storms like Florence. Are there some parts of this ordinance you still think need to get tweaked or maybe even a little stricter as time goes on?
Right now, I think it's good, at least for my area.